he kept asking, what does it mean to be a student today? I said, no, what does it mean to be human today? What differentiates us from the machines, right? I think is what is the value add we bring? What is the human ingenuity to this work? That's what we have to make sure that we keep leaning on, because the machines are going to keep iterating, getting better, behaving more human-like, taking more jobs. And I'm thinking about even my own personal, like I just finished last week doing all of my 9 leadership team members evaluation. Last year it took me, I don't know, 10 days to go through writing them, summarizing everything they've done for the year, etc. This year it took me a day.
JC, thanks so much for coming to my humble dining room, which has been turned into a studio, a bit makeshift. But, you watched me get everything set up. I still feel like totally out of my element, but it's been fun sort of learning about all the tools. So thank you for joining. We've crossed paths, I feel like almost every other month we're at an event together. But we usually don't have time to sit down and really catch up, usually between keynote sessions and closed door meetings with decision makers. But yeah, I'm hoping to use this time to nerd out with you a little bit, pick your brain on some of the stuff that I've been mulling over. Why don't you just help us get started by telling us about who you are and how you got to help the helm of Digital Promise, one of the leading education nonprofits in the country?
I agree. We have to make time for these kinds of conversations because we tend to be always running from one place, one thing to another. And the work really requires a kind of sort of retrospective conversation, reflection, frankly, for us to actually move forward. So again, impressive sort of setup you have here. Having a photography in my past, so I'm quite impressed with the setup you have here. So it's been a while in this business, in this work. Not one I ever intended to be a part of. My parents were teachers. My mom was a secondary school teacher. My dad was a school principal in Haiti, and I fell into teaching. And my mom convinced me when New York City was desperate for teachers. One August, they were short like 2,500 teachers for the beginning of school. Imagine that, mid-August. And she goes, give it a shot. Stay for a year or two, and while you find your way. That was more than 35 years ago that I went to teach in New York City public schools. And the first place I was assigned was a high school in Queens, and I got displaced, last in, first out. And then they reassigned me to Rikers Island to teach. I take some time to talk about this because it has been the foundation, effectively, for my thinking. So I got to Rikers, and I met a young man who looked just like me. I was barely 22, and he was 19 years of age, my physical size, etc., but couldn't read, do basic math, basic computation. And I was hired as a chemistry teacher. And, so we ended up doing math and basic science. And make a long story short, and when I write my book, that book is going to be called The Sandwich, because there's a story there, which I'm not going to give away. But this young man, in many ways, changed my life. And brought a lot of joy for me in a place that terrified me because I looked just like them. I grew a mustache and a beard. I wore a tie so I wouldn't be mistaken for an inmate. I said I had to make a difference in the lives of a lot of young people because in one semester, this young man went from doing basic computation to algebra. Really, really smart kid. And we lost a mathematician, I think. So I went to a middle school in Bushwick, Brooklyn, taught for 4 years there. I went to a high school, became principal at high school, and then just kept moving up the system. And I tell people that I applied for 2 jobs initially, one of being teacher, one of being superintendent of schools in Rochester, New York. So 22 years in New York City, never applied for anything, and just kept getting offers to do things differently. I was very lucky. I had amazing mentors in New York who taught me, who guardrailed me into making good decisions for myself. So principal, head of high schools, regional superintendent, where I learned elementary schools. I knew nothing about those in those days. Then went to Rochester, New York as a superintendent, did Chicago as a superintendent. There's a book called The Prize.
Chicago Public Schools?
Yes. There's a book called The Prize by Del Rosikoff that talks about the Zuckerberg 100 million in Newark. I'm on page 99 to 101. I don't know if you know this, Alex. I was supposed to go to Newark as superintendent, but Chicago, I guess Roman Manuel convinced me to come to Chicago instead. So I did make friends with Cory Booker when that happened. I love him dearly. I think he's an amazing leader. But I was meeting with Cory on a regular basis about just entry into Chicago. So in fast forward, leave Chicago College Board for a while as an advisor, then joined the Gates Foundation.
Forgot you were at Gates.
Yes, loved my time there, nearly 4 years. In fact, the only reason I left the Gates Foundation was because I got tired of traveling back and forth to Seattle. I still tell people I was traveling to work and for work, which is not the ideal thing to do in life, but I love my time there. And from there, I came to Digital Promise. And it's been an amazing transition. And I love this organization and what it does.
Were you traveling from New York or from
No,
California?
so I moved to California because my wife took a job at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And then I was consulting at the time, and I was on the red eye every Sunday night, go to the East Coast. I had portfolio work in Nashville, in Illinois, and in Connecticut. It just took me on the East Coast. And I quickly found that to be not conducive, frankly, to family life. And then, I left that.
Yeah, and you're in the Valley, right? Like Menlo Park or Palo Alto?
I live in Los Altos.
Los Altos.
But I actually live in
Nice.
Menlo. So we moved to the peninsula because, again, CZI in those days was in Palo Alto, then moved to Edward City. So California, here we came. And I love living in this state. And my wife was like, do you mind moving to California? And I said, no, it's a bucket list thing, man. I said, I'd love to live in California. So I've been here for 8 years here in the beautiful
Okay.
state of California.
I'm pretty close, actually. I think I'm like almost coming on 10, maybe 9.5. But also, I grew up East Coast. And yes, it was definitely a bucket list for me. But I just was going back and forth to the East Coast this past week. It's hard enough. I do it like once every 2 months or something like that. I can't imagine multiple times a month.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely not.
Yes.
But that was helppul. I don't always put people on the spot to kind of walk through their resume. I think it's important grounding, because what I'm really interested in discussing with you is sort of this experience that you've had as all these issues that in your various roles, and it's worth for our audience, Chicago Public Schools is what, third biggest district in the country?
It was. I think Miami just passed it.
Miami did? Okay.
Yeah, it was the third biggest. About 420,000 when I was there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's the total number of K-12 students in Arkansas or something. One of the, maybe North Dakota.
Yeah. I used to say that we had more dropouts in New York City than most systems had kids.
Right. Well, because New York is 1 million.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you've been in the education space, as long as anybody. And all of a sudden now, people who've never really thought about education are talking about the future of work and the skills and what should education look like. And I'm curious how much of it, and obviously AI is driving a lot of that. And I'm curious how much of that is, are you like, yeah, like this is what we've been talking about, and how much of that is truly like novel? Yeah, just from your vantage point, like how have you reacted to sort of this zeitgeist moment and, the excitement, but also sort of just like the noise?
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. I did a talk this morning and described dinner I had with a bunch of my students 2 weeks ago in Brooklyn. About 40 of my kids joined me in Brooklyn. We all had dinner. And these were my kids in my class, in my physics class. And we talked about really where they are today and what we talked about. And what I realized in their description of my work as a teacher, as a principal, was that I laid the foundation for them for their future. One told me that every decision he makes now, he thinks about what would Brizard say? What would he have said if I did this? So you never realize the kind of impact you have. And when you're looking at everything we talk about today about the future of work, talking about redefining success, it goes back to what many of us have done, and I'm not putting myself on the pedestal here, but many of us have done for eons, right? Because we know that education wasn't just about academic proficiency. It really was about lifelong outcomes for young people. And I think even the AI revolution is a latest iteration of pushing us there. So let me qualify that. When I became a principal, and that story, by the way, is still on the web. If you Google Chief Information Officer magazine, Brizard, you'll find an article called The School Grows in Brooklyn. It was published in 2001. It is still on the web. It talks about the reform and redesign of George Westinghouse High School, a school that used to be called Hip Hop High, because Jay-Z, Busta Rhymes, Lil Kim, Biggie all went to that school before my time. We qualify that because Jay-Z is about my age. But when I was a teacher, I became principal of that school. But the redesign of the school is chronicled in this article by Cheryl Benson about a school moving from old-fashioned vocational education to career tech or frankly technology-based work. Again, AI was not part of our verbiage, but certainly we talked about technology-enabled education. And the discussions we have about the future of work, what technology is doing to the future of work, that was part of our conversation. And I remembered my first PTA meeting in the redesign of the school. I was warned, they're coming for you, be careful, because I was closing down certain programs in the school, like jewelry making, for example, right? And I walked in there with the Daily News, the New York Post, the New York Times, all the newspapers in New York City, even before online ads all been at the same time. And I asked all the parents and some teachers were in the audience, can you help me find a job here for jewelry makers? There were none. But there was job for CCNA, for CCNP, for all the networking technologies, etc. And we're looking to create these kinds of programs in the school to really give kids a future, one that's scaffolded to post-secondary and a post-secondary to work. I didn't fully appreciate and understand the non-academic importance. When you look at the portrait for Alpha for graduate right now, you see these things showing up. Didn't fully appreciate that. But at the same time, we knew we had to put kids on a path toward a meaningful life and a meaningful career. In a dead and esoteric job, one that was being taken over by technology, right? Most costume jewelry is made by tech. I mean, very few handmade things these days, right? We saw it coming, so we prepared for that. So for me, this is the same discussion, slightly iterated for the latest technology, right? That we keep having about really redefining success and the future to go beyond proficiency, to think about what is it that we want kids to be able to do and thrive in 20 years and 10 years. That was always part of our discussion and conversation when I was a teacher, when I was a principal.
Yeah, and this grounding is important because I think there is one. I mean, you tell me, but my sense is that there's something different between 2001 or let's say 2007 with like mobile, 2013 with like sort of cloud and big data, and ML like 2014, 2015. Education leaders were long talking about, you know, uh, uh, what is the portrait of a graduate? You know, what does school transformation look like? We heard a lot about 21st century skills. I think it's interesting, right? Like maybe we didn't know what we were really talking about. It turns out we were talking about AI, right? This 21st century skills. Um, my sense is most people were not at the dinner table having conversations about school transformation.
Mhm.
Um, and today, I'd wager that most dinner tables, parents, teachers, superintendents, everybody's having a conversation about this because they're touching it, they're feeling it. And I have mixed feelings about what that means. It's exciting that this is now getting people's attention. Um, but it's also there is a lot of hype, and whether we're in a bubble, I don't know. That's a separate discussion. But there's a lot of hype to sift through, and I'm curious if you think like, is it helpful to have more attention, or does it actually make it more complicated and confusing to get to the sort of like the clear, so what? What are we supposed to do about it?
No, it's always to have, in my opinion, it's always good to have more attention, but cutting through the noise, I think, becomes more of the challenge, right? There's a reason I think you're seeing or hearing this discussion at every dinner table. Because in the past, even to get back to 2001, the kids I was serving in Brooklyn, mostly black, brown, poor kids, were the ones many of us were worried about. The middle class or upper income kids, they were on a river to post secondary in careers that were pretty solid and that was going to be around for a while. But now when you look, so the thing about AI, and I agree, it is a similar conversation, but an accelerated one. It really is an exponential growth in technology. So we argue AI has been around in education since 1975. But when you look at the speed at which it is moving now, it is accelerated, it is exponential. And now we see it's going to impact my kids, right? And my kids go to a Silicon Valley school, right? That's attended by many Google employees in their children. So these are the kids of what my kids are surrounded by, right? But now I think a lot of parents, even the middle and upper income parents, are seeing the possibility that the jobs that they have are going to disappear or will change, fundamentally change. I mean, there's a guy named Andrew McAfee from, he was to be at MIT. He talks about this idea they're coming for our jobs. He showed an article written for the Wall Street Journal that was written by an algorithm. And he said, and I quote, wait till this algorithm wins a Pulitzer. So we're seeing that even the white collar positions, jobs, have the potential to disappear. So many parents are worried about the future. So when you look at the kinds of portrait, the kinds of things many of us are talking about now, we didn't fully understand them, but now we much more understand now. Because again, the School of Psychology has always known about this, but now the School of Education is catching up to the School of Psych, or they're talking to each other. We know we have to develop in young people the kind of skills and mindset and competencies that allows them to change jobs, that allows them to grow with a job, that allows them to see um, a future perhaps we don't see today. And there will not be an esoteric dead end job if we build those skills. The hard skills are important, but we understand now those kinds of competencies, and please don't call them soft skills because they're the ones who beget success. Those are the skills we have to teach for successful people. To give you a quick example, when I first got the digital promise, I put a Google sheet on the screen and I told my leadership team, and I have high-end sort of, R1 institution, MIT, Stanford graduates on my leadership, PhDs, etc. And I asked them each to write down 3 things that were instrumental to their success. And I gave them 15 minutes and I came back. No one listed their academic credential.
Oh,
And I said, why is that, right? They talked
can you give
about,
examples of some of the things they listed?
they talked about curiosity, tenacity. They talked about being able to extrapolate from content, be able to navigate a room, right? All this stuff we used to call soft skills, right? They didn't even notice they were doing that, but they were articulating the kinds of stuff you now see in a portrait. Yes, the portrait does include academic and cognitive development, but now we're beginning to fully appreciate and understand what has always begotten success are the kinds of skills that require you to invent a job, grow with a job, right? The kind of leadership tenacity, stuff that we know is critical for success. Now we know needs to be part of the curriculum, needs to be part of the pedagogical practice and development. A lot of middle-class parents find ways of giving their children that kind of experience. My 3 boys just came back from 3.5 weeks of sleepaway camp in upstate New York. My middle guy, who's, he's interesting, but he's a brilliant kid. Sunglasses, jacket, and tie, speaking in front of 400 people. He's 13 years old. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, right? That I know he'll be successful because he can navigate that kind of environment. So that's why I think you're seeing this discussion at the dinner table, and folks are worried. Some have dystopian views of AI because of that. Some are trying to stop it. You're not going to stop it. It's here. It's going to move. So elevate the pedagogy, elevate the work that we do in schools, and really prepare young people for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I've had conversations with, folks at some of the companies that we, talk to, and, senior executives who can pick up a phone and like basically guarantee that their kid is at the top of the list, the top of the stack of resumes. They're like, yeah, my son looking for a job for 6 months, computer science degree from Berkeley. His friends are all struggling to find jobs. And this is what like Derek Thompson's been covering, right? Like the record high unemployment rate among new college grads. Paradoxically, especially in like computer science and physics, anthropology is always number one. Those poor anthropologists. But computer science that is surprising to people because we, my parents are both immigrants, Lebanese immigrants. So it's like doctor, lawyer, maybe engineer, and God help you, man. I was getting my political science degree. My mom was like, oh, well, pre-law. And then after she knew that I wasn't going to be a lawyer, she's like, well, you can still get your PhD. I was like, what am I going to do with a PhD? She's like, it's just important to have, you have this degree. And that's because for like 100 years, there was this period where, having credentials and like specific domain expertise was that differentiating skill that companies were looking for. And so now AI comes into the language model specifically, sort of this sort of like general purpose, not AGI, but sort of general purpose tools. And so a lot of the expertise that we thought would sort of differentiate our kids and put them on a path to be able to command value in the labor market. And people sometimes push back and say education, the purpose of education isn't just getting a job, which I completely agree with. But that is really top of mind. I mean, like if you're a parent, you do care. There's all these secondary things that you really should be and are concerned with. But the first thing that you will say is like, I want to make sure my kid, as you said, is able to have a job and have dignity and have and you mentioned the ability to change jobs, which is really interesting because like this idea of agency is important, right? If you're just really good at pushing the button or using the tool, but you don't have that transferability, like I think that's part of this whole like, idea of like dignity and thriving that goes beyond just getting a job. Um, so so AI is increasingly going to be able to do maybe not the jobs, but the tasks. Um, it is really good at writing code. It is really good at writing, grant proposals and pitch emails and doing like backend this database integrations. My husband actually just did this 20 hours and he used Lovable. He never written a line of code in his life and he just like vibe coded this like Tinder app for venture capital. So now he just like swipes through his companies and when he finds a company he likes, he clicks on it. It auto populates. I think these Apollo and like Affinity. So it auto populates their CRM. It pulls, it scrapes, does a Google search, scrapes all the relevant information. I qualifies it, and he's like, you can buy this tool for like $12,000 a year. And I think there's lots of stories. You've probably seen stories in climbing. There's lots of stories in classrooms. Those stories people are starting to come across that more and more. And if you're astute, your mind immediately goes to like, this is just the beginning. How old is your oldest?
24,
24.
and the youngest is 9.
9. Okay. So, I mean, even your 24-year-old, 6, 7 years from now, they're still in the early part of their career. We've had AI for what, like 3 years now, like LLM sort of in the general public. How do you think about that trajectory? I mean, like we've seen a lot of change, but there's a lot more to come. Like how do we sort of have a conversation that's coherent given the uncertainty?
It's funny, I spent some time with a Boston College professor in upstate New York, 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago, and we're talking about this. And he kept asking, what does it mean to be a student today? I said, no, what does it mean to be human today? How do we define what differentiates us from the machines, right? I think is the thing we have to keep thinking about. What is the value add we bring? What is the human ingenuity to this work? That's what we have to make sure that we keep leaning on, because the machines are going to keep iterating, getting better, behaving more human-like, taking more jobs and changing jobs. I'm thinking about even my own personal, like I just finished last week doing all of my 9 leadership team members evaluation. Last year took me, I don't know, 10 days to go through writing them, summarizing everything they've done for the year, etc. This year it took me a day. Because I was using an AI tool to help me with the summary, with the collecting of data from my archives, right? Because like we meet once a month, twice a month, and I keep notes. I didn't have to mine all of them. I had to be in the middle, make sure that it was accurate, but my work was made hugely easy or easier compared to that. So you think about everything else that's happening. Look, I'm a commercial pilot. I can tell you machine learning has been part of my world for a very long time. I fly a plane that can land itself, right? I mean, not a 747, 757 or 737, a Cirrus, right? A small 4-seater. It's pretty fast for a 4-seater. But that's been part of my world now for years. And I remember when I moved from analog to digital and 2 giant iPads, and I'm flying a plane at, I don't know, 200, 250 miles an hour. It's amazing. So it's going to keep doing it, keep making our world safer as we do that. The question of what it means for that kind of lifelong understanding, how we keep making sure not just reinventing ourselves, but making sure we understand what it is to be human, that differentiates us from the work. That we don't become afraid of the technology, that we embrace it as a tool to support us. That is the challenge. I used to show educators Andrew McAfee's videos. They come in for our jobs, and I would say, this is like 12, 13 years ago. Say, are you scared or are you excited? And of course, many would say we struggle with basic math proficiency. That is scary. But at the same time, I think what's been happening, which is why I think folks are even more afraid of, the acceleration of the tech is there. The acceleration of the education pedagogy is not keeping up, and that's terrifying. The car I drive, I mean, I own a self-driving car, not a Waymo, but a self-driving car. This thing took me home. I wasn't feeling well, 270 miles from Central California back home.
I remember this story. You were like,
Yes.
you were at like a conference and you were like at 100, like 4-degree fever or something crazy.
Yes. It was a League of Innovative Schools. I had a high fever. It wasn't 104. I'd go to a hospital for sure. And I had to get home. And I pressed summons. The car came to me, and I got in the car and I pressed. Yes, I had to stay awake and make sure that I was an integral part of the journey. But it took me home 270 miles. So I mean, it's here. The world is here. What it means, frankly, for what we do and how we think about the future of work or the present of work, how we think about P12 and P16 work, all that becomes part of the way we have to really not just reinvent, but accelerate the changes in education to catch up to what is happening in technology. Or, as Andrew McAfee says, we're going to leave a whole population of people behind. And that's what I worry about. Worry about most.
Yeah, you haven't really, what I haven't heard from you is this idea that like, well, what we really need to do is make sure the kids are all using AI. And I'm not to say that you don't believe that, because you've also said you can't ignore the technology. But you're talking about critical thinking. You're talking about, I like this idea of like hard, durable skills as opposed to soft skills. Being able to communicate or just like sort of problem solve. I think about like Thomas's example, this vibe coding app that he built. It's there's a lot of troubleshooting and problem solving and, agency built into that. And I would guess that he would say this idea of like agency comes up if he were to be asked like sort of like what's been most important in my role in my career. Folks outside of education might say, well, yeah, well, duh. I mean, like these things are all important. Our school teaching and centering critical thinking in curriculum, like what does it look like today? If you could just paint a picture.
Yeah, I mean that's the child. I think look, NCLB, No Child Left Behind. In many ways, we know now the curriculum, and so many of us are fixated on reading and math proficiency. While we need to really quickly evolve to a broader definition of success, right? That's a big part of the challenge. We're still trying to catch up to 1975, and we need to be at at 2035. Frankly, that's part of the work that we need to do in education. When you look at the work, first of all, and I profess this on a regular basis, education is human development. You can't remove the human in the loop to be part of the interaction. I'm watching these schools trying to replace folks with AI, etc. That's going to be a dangerous, and I'm hoping a failed experiment, right? Because you can't outsource the education work. So I argue that every system or every school needs to have a coherent instructional system. How are you thinking about curriculum, pedagogical practice or instruction, assessment being embedded in pedagogy, and that loop remains? And how are you thinking about ubiquitous learning, what's happening at home and outside the school and within school? Um, I think the four walls of a school are really designed to be the socializing aspect of education. I said this nearly a decade ago in Aspen at the Aspen Institute, and people were like smiling and laughing at me. I'm like, nah, it's coming. I mean, the physical building becomes a place for socialization. Education's everywhere. One, we have to capture that learning. I think AI can help us actually do that. We need to understand how technology
Capture the learning in the sense of be able to measure.
or recognize the learning, right? Because the kids who are learning outside of school, that is not recognized. We think sitting for a 3-hour test is the way to do that, which is nonsense, right? We also understand that there is no such thing as neurotypical people. We're all neurodiverse. Todd Rose taught us that, right? With his book, The End of Average. Yet everything is built around the average person, the 3-hour test, a 40-minute period. That needs to completely be abolished. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching is abolishing the Carnegie Unit, which since 1906 has conflated time and learning, right? So I think it's an amazing thing. So when you look at the portrait of a graduate, right? Now there's states who are pushing this across the state, and look at the portrait. Look what it says. Yes, it's academic, cognitive, but you see a lot of other stuff in there that is sometimes referred to as the doable skills. Also, the doable skills framework I love, but it's too many of them, right?
It's like, it says
Yeah.
wheel, and it's like,
Yeah, it's way too many. But what I'm talking about, they need to be scientifically based into the definition. We have a definition of powerful learning, a digital promise, that lists some of the key things like curiosity, agency, etc. But every word you find in that definition is scientifically linked to the learning sciences. It is not something someone invented. It is part of what we know about neuroscience. So when you think about coherent instructional system, one big in this idea of the portrait, one that looks at the non-academic and the academic, right? Then you can begin to understand the role of AI and technology in enabling that to actually happen. But the coherent system needs to be first and foremost. I mean, just name two school systems who do an amazing job of maybe there's three I can name, who are doing an amazing job of integrating the portrait into the every single day. Talladega County, Alabama is one, right? Fayette County in Pennsylvania is another. There's a few Pennsylvania districts who are doing this. One has this thing called the portrait of a Talbot, it's a dog, right? But when you walk into that school or the school system or the schools, every child knows what that is and what it means. If you ask them, Alex, show me how tenacity show up in this art class, they will tell you. In Talladega, they get so granular, they can tell you what this looks like Monday morning, 9 a.m., fourth grade math class. It is embedded in the pedagogy, in the curriculum, in the units of study. Teachers own it, kids own it, right? It is not the superintendent. She did her job. So my point very simply is that when you look at what we need to do, it needs to show up in a granular way in the fabric of schools to prepare kids for a future that we don't really understand yet what's going to happen. I did walk into a school a year ago, I won't name where one of the pathways was truck driving. I walked out with like like pain in my stomach. I'm like, that job will disappear in about 4 years. So these are high school kids. What are you preparing them for? So the idea of making sure that we're preparing young people to be malleable, to really move and change and grow and navigate, that is the work for us in education.
And this idea of being granular, I think, is just alludes to it's easier said than done. Actually, and you were at Chicago Public Schools. So at New York City's 100,000 teachers, so CPS is probably what, 40,000?
About 28,000 teachers.
28,000. Okay. It's a big human machine to move. And so I think part of why we cling to assessments and specific standards and, learning outcomes, subject by subject is this, that it feels like the one thing that we can measure. And, we also have just gone through this period of obsession with data. I think for good reason, it's important to have data, but it's hard to think about data collection for something like critical thinking. Not impossible, but it's not something that's just intuitively going to happen without either a carrot or a stick. And so with Talladega, like what was the driver that went from, 0 to, fourth period, 8:30 a.m., the student could tell you where tenacity is showing up.
So the driver was not the summative state assessment, whether it be smarter, balance, or POC. That was not the driver to making this happen. It was when you look at the design of the portrait, and it's done typically with community, with teachers, with students at the table, design what they want the portrait to be. Just in the design process, you create agency and ownership of the work. So when you look at Talladega, there was a deliberate 3-year process of integration that really involved the teachers and the students in really the design of the units of study. So it's not, you go slow to go fast, basically, right? It can't be a mandate to say you must do this, but you involve people so they understand why this is so critical and important. What is frustrating many educators is that we have not had the same investment in assessment. So this is where when you look at the conditions for powerful learning, it can't be put on the heads of teachers or principals, or for that matter, even the superintendent, right? So there is as Michael Fullen described, the outside, inside, the inside, outside story of the 3 stories of school reform. Where's the state house? Yes, the feds have a role. This is where perhaps I disagree with our Secretary of Education. The feds have a role in this. The states have a bigger role in this in terms of setting the conditions for success. You think about the investment in assessment. We've made some investment in curriculum, like HQIM, high quality instructional materials. We've made investments in standards. We did with the Common Core state standards. We have not had the same requisite investment in assessment. So we have a myopic measuring tool against something we know is critical and important. But at the same time, when you look at ETS and their work with Carnegie and others, they are looking to this. Right now, Carnegie just launched this high school redesign process, right? And when you look at the work they're trying to do is to go back to the pivot the fulcrum of education reform, which I think is the high school, and come back to what we have failed to scale and begin to remove the constraints, right? Let me give you a quick story, Alex. When I was at the high schools in New York City, I kept staring at the regulation. And to get a Carnegie a credit in New York, Carnegie in New York State, you have to meet two criteria: mastery of content and seat time. So I called the commissioner's office and I said, what if you earn a failure? Meaning you come to school every single day or you have the minimal attendance and you fail the class. Do you have to sit for the class again or could you just demonstrate mastery? Yes, of course you can just demonstrate mastery. So I ran up to Joel Klein's office in New York, like, look what I just discovered. And everybody around him, Joel, of course, I love Joel. Like, he was bullish, like, yes, let's go do this. But everyone was like, slow down. Do you know what this means if you do this? And like, tell me. I said, summer school, jobs, etc., are going to be lost. So the bureaucracy clamped down on innovation, thereby not creating the conditions for that kind of powerful learning. Again, maybe I'm stretching this a bit, but when you think about the role of the system in creating those conditions, investment that we have to make in assessment, the feds can do this with NSF and IES. Let's get next generation assessments. Because right now, assessment is a thing, it's a place, it's an event. It does not really measure really learning. Sorry, one last quick story. My 13-year-old, 2 years ago, blew up math, did really well in mathematics. Last year, tanked. Like, what the hell happened, He goes, oh, you mean that test? I don't care about that thing, He never took the assessment seriously because he saw no value in it, right? So if we change that, then we have a chance, frankly, and AI can actually help us get there.
Your anecdote about, all the disruption that would have to happen in that school system to make even just one change, not all the change, but even just like one change. So this is the challenge of school transformation is it's like there's 14,000 school districts in the US. There's some states that can be quite impactful top down. Many states like, in Ohio and Michigan, and I won't throw any more on the bus, but I can say in Ohio and Michigan for sure, it is not top down. Colorado, same thing, right? Like there are mechanisms that the state can use and standards and all these things. But even with standards, right? Like Ohio created, computer science standards through, I would say like mixed effect if we're being gratuitous. You're going district by district and each district has its own context. This is really, really hard. And this is why I was talking to somebody at one of the big, elite philanthropy consultancies. And I didn't realize this, but actually like K-12 philanthropy has decreased over the last 10 years. And I was like, well, like what's behind that? I mean, the need is more important than ever. And they're like, yeah, but these funders, they've been funding school transformation. And they're like 10 years later, they're seeing, maybe at best you could call it stagnant. I think actually the NAEP score suggested it's even starting to trend in the wrong direction. And there's this sense of like, well, we just can't, this is an impossible task. Let's focus on something where we can actually move the needle. Which brings us around back to this whole conversation about the dinner table, because I'm curious about how we can, I think our orgs do this really well. This is why we sort of are such kindred spirits, both you and I, but also aiEDU and Digital Promise. Our readiness framework, just sort of like, give you some accolades. Like we really started with Digital Promise, Portrait of a Graduate, and your AI literacy framework. But you had the Portrait of a Graduate that underpinned. It wasn't just about, okay, what do we do with this AI thing? It was holistic. I'm going to, rather than pose this as a question, I don't want to make it a loaded question. I have a perspective. So maybe you can just refine it for me or maybe give me some feedback. So my theory is people are having conversations about AI at the dinner table. They have a lot of concern about work and the future of careers. There's other stuff that they should be concerned about. AI companions and deepfakes might start to get up there. It's not quite there yet, but it will. But jobs and careers, that is really what parents are asking about. How do we use this moment to, while jobs are not the only point of school, you can actually justify a doubling down on all of the durable skills, the human advantage that you're talking about. We can now directly connect that to success post-secondary and success in your career, because these are now one and the same. Companies are not going to pay you if you have a skill that AI can do. They're going to be looking for what do you add? What is the value that you add as a human? How can we sort of like basically harness that excitement, that energy towards moving the needle on systems change and like bringing in some of the people that maybe weren't showing up to the school board meetings, but now actually, you know what, they might come and the question is like, what, how do we enlist them? Like, how do we enlist parents and maybe even policymakers that are wondering whether this is a sort of a legacy building moment for them?
Yeah, so what you're describing is a level of frustration amongst parents and amongst funders, etc. But let me start with the first thing you push around funders. And as a former funder, we need to take some responsibility for what funders are frustrated with, meaning funders taking some responsibility. One thing I heard very clearly at Gates as I traveled my communities, and my portfolio was called the P16 Community Investment Team. So we were much more around systems design, systems change. And we had a group tell us, you guys fund programs, then you expect systems change. That is, so many of us in the funding world look for these uh, magic elixirs, these silver bullets, or these one thing that will change these technocratic solutions to very complex problems and challenges, right? We have to take a step back and say, really, what are we, what were we funding to support the kind of transformation? So there is some level of responsibility on the part of funders as well for the frustration, but the frustration is real, and I completely agree. And this is where perhaps Linda McMahon and I align that trillions have been spent on education in the past X number of years without the results for it. Michael Fullin's about to publish a book, 50 years of education reform, and we've not moved the needle. And the question is, first of all, what needle are we talking about? That's a part of the problem too. How do we define success? We don't have a good definition of success. And there are lots of reasons for this. I met with the Lego team in Denmark and asked me to talk about US education and the balkanization that we see in this country. And Chicago is a perfect example of balkanization, right? Where, and that was our push. We can show this in Philadelphia, in Chicago. I can show you two kids, two different parts of the city, vastly different outcomes based on traditional measures. And we know that has to do very often with the resource allocation. I don't mean money, but quality of teachers, quality of curriculum, quality of dollars coming into a system. I can show you in Chicago, when I got there, chemistry one in one part of the city was not chemistry one in the other part of the city. Yes, standards changed that. So you can move a large system. It requires real strategy, not firefighting. We're taking a look at, even if a state, yeah, I'm a big fan of Ohio, love that state chief. And my good friend in Utah just retired, Sidney Dixon, is another powerhouse. When you look at these kinds of states who have a clear sort of, in they understand what we call strategic agility, how do you actually move up into the system and pull the right levers to get things done without forcing just a top-down initiative? So it's possible. Joe Klein demonstrated that in New York City. You may not like what he did, but he moved that battleship with a paddle. He made it happen. It can happen. It can work, but it requires deliberate action and deliberate strategy. To the other parts, I think, and I'm losing my train here, about the second part of your push around the table, parents, etc.
Connecting the this like new wave of interest in the future of work
Yes.
to creating more of the conditions for the good exemplars that you've shared, because there's lots of different people behind it. Like, is there like a big sort of public awareness campaign, or like, and who matters to this? Because, you know, most people would say, well, I don't know a superintendent that I could talk to. Like, who is impactful and sort of like pushing schools in the direction that you're describing?
That's a great point. You know, I think that's missing right now, frankly, in America, right? So, like, well, who's the voice? Who are the voices of this conversation? Especially given the fact that the feds are looking to the evolution, saying that we no longer own this. The states need to own this. We're a critical inflection point in education in this country, where things are moving faster than we are keeping up with. Without that coherent and cogent voice, again, you may not like Ani Duncan or what happened, who raised to the top, etc., but there was clear voice coming out of Washington, right? We don't have that right now, and we need that desperately. When people tell me they are frustrated with public education and they're looking for alternatives, right? I mean, the vast majority of parents in this country go to public education, right? They can't afford to go elsewhere. So it is still the place to make the changes that can be happening. I know groups like AASA, the Association for American School Superintendents, are trying to figure out. I was part of a group that helped design their new sort of framework around education. So all that requires leadership. in terms of really articulating the next framework that we need to worry about. And that framework needs to take a look at the granular work of curriculum, of instruction, of pedagogy, leaning on the portrait of a graduate that really builds a human ingenuity into work, that embraces technology. It helps us understand the role of AI in education, right? Without outsourcing our work to the machines, right? But it requires that kind of deliberate understanding of the major levers we have not pulled: investment in assessment, redefining success, the redefining an accountability framework, which right now is very myopic, right? Um, when I was in Rochester, New York as a superintendent, my my only blue ribbon school, my best school in the city, World of Inquiry School number 58, right, was an EL school, Expeditionary Learning School. They focus a lot on what we call now the portrait. Their reading and math scores were above 90th percentile proficiency for the entire school, 78% poverty.
Oh,
They didn't focus on the test. They focused on developing the capacity of young people. I watched a fourth grader lead morning meeting for the entire school. You walk out there, you're crying because to see a kid that old, 10-year-old, leading 500 people in conversation, right? That does not come from focusing on just reading and math proficiency. It's building the kind of human ingenuity I'm talking about. So we know how to do this. The question is, how can we execute on that at scale? That is the challenge for us.
our organization is very focused on the grassroots and sort of like building that, like the field game, as it were. And what I keep hearing, I'm hearing you center leadership, and I have to say, like, that there is, it's not that it's missing. There are a lot of amazing leaders out there. I think what's missing is AI is so novel, and it's been gate kept. I mean, when I started into AI, when I founded aiEDU 6 years ago, 6.5 years ago, there were some funders who quizzed me. They were like, asked me like, technical questions, which I got one wrong. It was really embarrassing. And that has been the vibe, it's like, well, this is for the technologists. Like, we're going to figure this out. And even frankly, the biggest AI company, some of the biggest AI companies, so there's like this laser focus on AGI. It's kind of like we don't even have to worry about sort of like these interim challenges because we're going to this other place. It's so, you can't even, this is kind of the rhetoric, right? It's like you can't really even imagine what it's going to be like. You have to take our word for it. And it's very chilling if you're a school leader and you want to take action, but you feel like you don't have the depth. I don't know that we've quite even cracked the code on like, how do you equip, because a superintendent is not gonna be able to sit through 20 or 30 hours of PD. A small number might be able to, but most will not. How do we cultivate that next generation of leaders who understand this is a legacy, once in a generation moment? This is the thing you're gonna be telling your grandkids about. They have that desire, but they feel frozen in terms of, well, I don't feel like I am equipped to dictate what to do. And then so you lean on these, tool providers who have lots of ideas about what you should be doing, but it's not necessarily, it's very, very different from what you're describing. Where do we start?
And so I don't want to rely on the next generation of leaders first. We don't have the luxury because the world is changing too quickly. We have a cadre of leaders. Yes, we have many good ones, but we have folks not picking up the ball. And I said this to the secretary that even the state strategy, there's some amazing state chiefs, and we named some, right? Ohio, Utah, etc. But the vast majority, the majority of states are compliance machines. They're not innovation machines. And how do we change that? We have a cadre of leaders now we've got to push to understand, and or we need to provide the kind of support to the systems to catch up and move quickly. Otherwise, the folks who are frustrated with public education are going to find ways to bypass teachers, to bypass schools, right? And that, I think, is going to be a disaster for many of our kids, especially the kids who don't have access to these places or going to be left behind, which is going to create the kinds of issues, the sort of moral fabric of our country will continue to decline, right? That is part of my worry, that what you're seeing in many parts of the world right now around this leaning toward fascism is because many of these folks do not have access to economic mobility, so they're angry. Andrew McAfee predicted this back 13 years ago, where he compared two white guys. One is a blue-collar truck driver, one is a white-collar Silicon Valley tech person, right? One is thriving and one is tanking. We've got to worry about, with the future of work, we have to worry about making sure the access is not just around race lines. It's around economic lines, right? Rural Ohio, rural Pennsylvania, rural Alabama is as important as what's happening in Manhattan, New York, right? So we've got to make sure that our systems are prepared for this. And the leaders we have right now, we've got to push them and make it happen. Sometimes it requires the kind of work you do and even convenings or working with regions, which I think, frankly, might be the solution. How do you take a regional cluster of leaders and build a capacity to really understand, one, the work of education, right? A coherent instructional system, and the work of technology in accelerating and supporting. We have to help create coherence in the ways in which we approach reform. And that might be done, frankly, with the kind of work you do in regions, the work we do, the digital policy in regions around the country. One last thing very quickly. I was in Uruguay maybe 6-7 weeks ago. I saw a nation that is moving. And the first thing they did was to close the digital gap. Then they closed the digital learning gap. Now they're moving computational thinking across the country. I
Really,
saw
CT specifically, not
CT
CS.
specifically. Yes. They took our framework of digital promise and they build a scope and sequence around it. We saw the policy, we saw the national conversation, then we visited classrooms and we saw the through line, right? This is happening across an entire country, tiny country in South America. They have closed, and they're closing the gap. They're about to build an AI lab for the nation. And so they think writ large. And what they did, by the way, was create this organization called SABAL. I call it a cousin organization to Digital Promise because we do very similar things. This organization is not the Ministry of Education. It has 3 board members: the president of SABAL, the minister of education, and the minister of finance. The president of the country appoints the president of SABAL. So 3 individuals manage, and their job is to agitate and to demonstrate and to make happen with support from the ministry, but their job is to push on the ministry. The finance minister provides the support and funding to make it happen. They're becoming quickly the envy of the world because they have done it. We can, we're the most powerful country in the world. If Uruguay can do it, we can do it here.
Yeah, I just wrote this very long. All my pieces are long. It's how I think. If I don't write it down, it's hard for me to, which is a whole separate segue about. I've learned a lot about the future of work as I've failed to use AI to write. It can write quite well, but it doesn't. I don't benefit from the process. And one of the things that I sort of fell into as I was kind of I was writing about the American AI Action Plan, and I was around for when I got into the AI space was right after the U.S.-China pivot. This is like 2017. National Security Council, like formally now China is a competitive risk. Huawei was added to the special entities. What's it called? There's a list of like companies you're not supposed to do
forgot too.
business with.
Yes.
And that year, China put out this big push on AI and education. The next year, 2018, they put out an action plan for artificial intelligence in education, I think in higher education. And as I was sort of going through this process and sort of like going through the translation, and they do a control F to see like how many times education and workforce and like reskilling are mentioned, and it's like all throughout the document. And I had this realization that we've and then Biden comes in. The Biden administration is this is still a line. They capped the export controls on like semiconductors, essentially maintained course. But there wasn't as much of this. I think that there was a reticence to really lean into like the U.S.-China conflict as a driver, and certainly we did not. We thought about this a lot. Like, oh, is this something we pitched to funders? As like we are in a race against China, and at the time, me and my team were of the opinion that this is bad vibes, right? Like we're talking to educators, to school leaders, coming in and trying to like paint this in this like broad geopolitical, like zero sum frame. Just that wasn't our brand. But I feel like now the U.S. government has made it very clear with the American AI Action Plan that this is, the preamble is explicit. It's like we are in a race. I suppose there's a question of like, oh, should we push back? And I don't think our organizations, that's not what we do, right? We're not. So there's the whole political strategy, but absent that, this is the status quo. But hearing you talk, I feel like there's maybe there is some power in this because like if we're trying to really motivate leaders, a little bit of competition, maybe even a lot of competition, like that might be something that is sort of gets them out of their seat. And I wouldn't, but what you're describing isn't necessarily U.S. China geopolitics. You're even describing like, Ohio and Michigan. Maybe it actually is okay for them to feel a little bit of pressure. Like, do we really want to be behind? Um, and that actually is what happened in Michigan. We, we have this like statewide strategy in Ohio, and Michigan's like, we could totally do that. Like, what's required? The answer is we just need a line. Do we just need literally leaders to step up, initially philanthropy and civil society, and then
Yeah.
in Michigan, specifically, it's like Detroit public schools and then the long tail of rural districts.
But I mean, like, there are parts of this country where the work is easier, right? So like New York, for example, has what, over 700 or 800 school districts. A little harder. Illinois, too many school districts. I mean, can be done, but much more difficult. You go to Rhode Island, you can fit the entire state in the conference room, and Angelica will tell you that. And at one point, I was a finalist for the state job in Rhode Island. In my research, I discovered, I think, like 70% of teachers came from one university, from one college in the state.
University of Rhode Island.
I forgot which one it was. It was not Brown, but I can tell you that once you discover that, oh my God, if I work with the School of Education on pre-service, I can impact the lives of 70% of my teachers, right? So there are places like that in America where we can demonstrate quick movement around reform, and what we've been describing in a much more cogent place. So it can be done. This thing with China, by the way, so we've had, I think, in my opinion, many Sputnik moments after Sputnik. We've not captured them, or it's not been as.
What were some examples?
I mean, look, this some of it has been soft. Let's use China as the example, right? Where they're quickly becoming the world leader in technology, right? So it's not like a moment, but several small moments. What somebody used to describe as the boil frog syndrome, which frogs, by the way, don't sit in the water; they'll jump right out. But when you think about it, it hasn't been as marked, as pronounced. I was part of a discussion last week in Aspen, with the Aspen Institute, and the China Fellowship was there. We're all talking about China, are they a threat, or are they, frankly, something to learn from? I mean, China at one point in history was top of the world in GDP, right? Then it went through a few hundred years of extreme
So you're going quite far back, but yes, yeah.
poverty,
Yeah.
right? In 30 years, they've moved 800 million people out of poverty.
Yeah, the average GDP in China, this was like around like, I think Deng Xiaoping, early on in his tenure, it was like $200 per capita.
You look now. I mean, yes, it means flattening out a little bit. But my point is that love or hate China, whatever you want to do, right? There's a lesson there that we need to learn. As a nation, as the most powerful country in the world, we can make it happen for poor people. And we have to understand that we're never going to be really successful until the poorest part of our country actually move forward. But the bottom line is, when you look at the work of, again, states and regions, it can be done in a way that can demonstrate success. I don't know what's going to happen with Mo Green in North Carolina, but the last state chief, I know Mo from his work in Guilford, but the last state chief was somebody we were talking to, quite progressive as well, too. And North Carolina is one to watch if they keep moving in that direction. I'm heading to a rally in about a month to talk to leaders in Raleigh, on the Research Triangle. So there are parts of the country who are pushing. Let me come back to Pittsburgh. Our last League of Innovative Schools meeting was in Pittsburgh. 13 school systems supported by the Grable Foundation have banded together to create a regional innovation hub. I mean, so we have these catalysts in America, but we have not really learned how to leverage them in a way that pushes the kind of scale we're talking about. And this is where I'm begging our secretary. This is the kind of leadership that we need from Washington. Yes, do whatever you want with the money, etc., but support these kinds of regional hub. The state of Alabama is doing amazing work on cyber security with the Walton Foundation and our team. You've got these things happening in the U.S. We've got to highlight them. We've got to leverage them for scale reform in this country.
Yeah, and I want to. The good interviews, what I've learned is the key to being a really good interviewer is to just have a good guest with a lot to say. So the time flew by. I do want to close with a bit of a call to action. I'm going to be explicit. I think you and I can be explicit because we've we've done this work together. I think we both have a clear view of like what needs to be done. I've had several meetings at the White House talking about the AI literacy executive order, and I don't know what the chances are of shifting their perspectives. It seems quite clear. Like they see this as something for states to lead on and public-private partnerships. And then you have, like in Oregon, NVIDIA partnering with the Department of Education. And the headline was like, it was like this big flashy headline, but then you look into it, it's like, no, this is NVIDIA's Deep Learning Institute, which is NVIDIA's thing. It's like, this is training people to be in the NVIDIA ecosystem. That is not what you are describing. That is capture, right, by technology companies. Not saying NVIDIA shouldn't be working in Oregon. That's great. It's good, but it's like they can't be the only organization, only company. So you have you have education philanthropy. Sure, maybe there's some learnings to be had from the last 20 or 30, 40 years. But now it's, like it or not, they're being handed, this incredible responsibility. Our organizations, I think, work together quite well because we're just we're just so complementary. It's like we don't have the bandwidth to be in Pittsburgh. And I think the way that you've designed your frameworks, Portrait of a Graduate, the way we've designed our framework, the idea is to be able to go to a school, if they're working with Digital Promise, that they're in the League of Innovative Schools, it's not choosing a framework. There's lots of frameworks, and I think some of this sense of like, who's going to win the framework battle? It's like, we're just now trying to figure like, how do we make it as interoperable as possible? Because like what we want to be able to do is go to a school and say, whatever you've done, that is awesome. Let's identify what else you need to do to keep moving forward. And so setting up exemplars, we're aligned, right? Like we need more of them. How do we how do we convince philanthropy that yes, investing in tools and AI for blank, it's important, and we need, just like we need philanthropy to balance, corporate investment and education, we also need them to balance corporate investment in the tooling. But how do we get them to sort of like widen their aperture and really think about like the systems change, investing on the ground, investing in leaders, investing in, direct program work. You mentioned pre-service. I mean, there's a lot of like really ripe areas, and I am not hearing as many funders as you'd expect, like identifying those. And it's not because they don't believe it. I think they still see themselves as in learning mode. And it's like, how do we shift them out of this, like, sitting back and like waiting for the world to happen to like really seeing themselves as like, I'm going to lead, back to your sort of the thesis of this whole conversation.
And there are many funders I know who think broader and bigger. They still have a layer of accountability that they have to have with the money they're giving away, but they do think about the bigger, broader picture. When I was at Gates, there was something that Warren Buffett used to say to the all hands meeting once a year that I've never forgotten. He goes, swing for the fences. You guys can do this. You can afford to do this. So swing for the fences. I mean, I always took that to heart. And it's something that I've always believed around. It's the idea of taking bigger, taking broader. And this fund I'm dealing with right now, I love talking to her because she sees things even beyond where I see it. Like, oh my God, yes. Let's think 5 years down the road. How are we going to fix this working solution? Also, don't expect a single funder to be able to do that. Let's be clear about that too. I think no one can do research or fund research like the U.S. government. That's what's made us who we are as a country. And I'm really hoping that, as we move forward, National Science Foundation, IES, yes, we need to be retooled. There's no question about that. That we don't forget, effectively, our place in research in the world. Let me just maybe say one more thing that I heard last week in Aspen with my friend Patrick Aoua, who's a MacArthur genius, created a Session University, gave up his leadership career at Microsoft and moved back to Ghana, to his home, and build an amazing university. He said we have to scale to the size of the problem. And no one institution can do that. It's got to be a collective. And this is where I think aiEDU, Digital Promise, and others working together can make a difference in the world. But we have to bend together. And I'm going to push on funders, maybe a call to action for funders too. And I've always loved this idea of funder collaborative. And when funders get together around a BHAG, a big hairy problem, right? And you get the right nonprofits together to work together and doing this kind of work, even for profits, you can get somewhere. Yes, I love what NVIDIA is doing. I like the fact that OpenAI is partnering with the AFT around Teacher Academy, but it can't be bespoke. It can't be about a single product line, right? Because you got Google, you got others who are doing amazing work in this space. this has to be about education, not about NVIDIA, not about OpenAI, right? If that makes sense. So that's an important piece, but this idea of funders coming together as a collaborative and supporting big, hairy challenges in education, and sometimes do so with the U.S. government. We've done projects with NSF, Gates, Walton, etc. We so desperately need more of that.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, and folks can look at our organization's funders for, like there's a very like there's a good cohort of early movers who sort of have that bigger lens, and there's a lot of funder collaborators. You've actually, I know you've spoken at probably many of them. So it's the reality that doesn't to me seem like funders are not doing their job or they're failing. It's that we're still in sort of this moment, and the question is still what's going to happen. I guess moving together de-risks it. It also allows you to achieve the scale, because funders they're big, but they're not that big, right? Like New York City public schools, what is the budget? Like 40 billion?
Is it that much now? It's 28 when I left.
I think it's 40 billion. So you see this like $23 million, like that's a big headline. And that's also for leasing space in New York City. So I don't know what the, what the lease is going to cost. Yes, this idea of sort of like, how do we bring everybody together? I mean, for folks who are listening, if they're in, curious, and I would say, JC is the person to talk to if you really want to have a sense of like what is possible. Your organization is not new to AI, and yet you're not a techie. You're tech literate. You're tech forward. You're an innovative thinker, but you're an education
I'm a
person.
teacher.
You're a teacher.
Yes.
And that's why we need, this is, I was so excited to have you on the show, and this is why we going back to sort of this idea of like building leaders. Like if you're a school principal, you're a teacher, if you're a school board member, if you're a superintendent, like this is your moment.
Yeah. It really is. It really is.
I see.
And it requires collaboration amongst them as well too.
Right.
Thank you.
Excellent. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Boom.
It's been a pleasure.
Easy.